The summer of that year was sultry and unbearable. The sun seemed to deliberately freeze at its zenith, melting the asphalt and turning the streets of Moscow into a scorching desert. Even at dusk, the city did not cool down, but was saturated with the thick smell of dust and heated iron. I remember getting out of a taxi on a quiet, almost deserted street in the center of the capital. The small alley was shaded by tall buildings with peeling plaster. The address given in the telegram I received the day before was unfamiliar. Street, house, no additional landmarks. The entrance, which I found after a long search, had neither a number nor a sign, just a rough iron door covered with rust. A man in uniform was standing by the door, smoking Bellamore. Colonel L. I recognized him immediately. We had crossed paths before, back when I served in one of the provincial NKVD departments. His stern face and cold gaze were well remembered. This man was like a stone, motionless and heartless. "Glad to meet you, comrade," he said, without extending his hand or even turning in my direction. His voice was hoarse and hard, like brittle metal. I nodded, feeling anxiety grow in my chest. "Do you know why you were called?" "No, Comrade Colonel." "And that's right, you'll find out now." He crushed the butt of his cigarette under his heel and pushed the door open. I followed him, and the door slammed shut behind me, as if it had cut me off from the familiar world forever. We walked along a narrow corridor lit by dim light bulbs. They blinked, casting long, writhing shadows on the walls. The colonel was silent, and I tried to stifle the growing sense of anxiety. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of running machinery or ventilation could be heard loudly. The air was cold, damp, and filled with the smell of metal and chemicals. On the ground floor, we crossed a long corridor and descended a steep staircase to the basement. The deeper we went, the more isolated we felt. This place seemed to be cut off from everything. Not a sound from outside, not the slightest hint of sunlight. It was dark and silent, punctuated only by footsteps. Soon we stopped in front of a massive unmarked metal door. The colonel took a bunch of keys out of his pocket, inserted one of them into the keyhole and turned it with effort. The door opened with a long screech. The room I entered was low, lit by bright lamps. In the center was a long table, at which there were 3 people. An elderly man in a gray suit, a woman with gray hair pulled back into a tight knot, and a military man with a rough granite-hewn face. On the table in front of them was a folder tied with string, and at the very top was my name. "Comrade," the woman began, but I realized that this was a formality. She sounded like she already knew what I was going to say. "You have been selected to participate in a project of national importance. The essence of the task is extremely secret, and the details will be known only to you. From that moment on, all your previous relationships, responsibilities, and even memories cease to exist. Do you agree?" I wanted to ask a question, but something in her voice silenced me. Instead, I nodded. The man in the military uniform continued. "The project is called Sphinx. Its purpose is to explore and develop the hidden capabilities of the human mind. We want to create a person who can control the minds of others. Open up new horizons." His voice was emotionless, as if he was talking about a planned upgrade of equipment. However, his words seemed to have carved a block of ice in my chest. "Your signature is here." The man in the gray suit handed me a folder. "And remember, from now on, you belong to the project." My hands were shaking as I picked up a pen and signed the documents. I knew that I had just crossed a line beyond which there would be no return or forgiveness. After that, I was taken to the complex itself. I expected to see ordinary offices or laboratories, but the corridors through which the colonel led me looked like anything but a scientific institution. Everything here was sterile, featureless, and cold. We stopped at the window, behind which was a small room with concrete walls. There was a man sitting inside, under a bright light. A middle-aged man, thin, with short dark hair and a haggard face. His eyes were empty, and he stared straight ahead, as if through walls. "This is the first target," Colonel L said. I looked at him, but he didn't explain anything. I wanted to ask, what did they do to him? But my voice is gone. The next day, they started telling me the details. The experiments were aimed at revealing the hidden mental abilities of a person. The subjects were subjected to hypnosis, sleep deprivation, exposure to sounds and light. There were also more terrible methods, psychotropic substances, electric shocks. In the second week, I heard the first scream. It rang out at night, breaking the dead silence. It was an inhuman, bestial scream, full of pain and horror. I rushed to the door, but the technician stopped me. "Get used to it, comrade," he said indifferently. "Everyone is shouting here." I went back to my room, but I couldn't sleep for a long time. That scream stayed with me forever, as a reminder of where I was and what now lived inside those walls. I spent the first week poring over a mountain of dossiers that I was given to study. Every sheet, every photograph was a documentary confirmation of the human tragedy. These people were called objects. No one spoke their names. Only numbers. 014, 001, 034. Their entire former lives were erased, turned into lines of reports, age, gender, profession, special remarks. The latter always sounded cold and intimidating. Suspicion of mental disorders. The first on the list was 014. Dmitry Vasilyevich Kovalenko, 33 years old, a native of the Belarusian SSR, a pianist. The report states, arrested for refusing to speak at a party meeting. It looked almost corny until I read on. The subject showed pronounced emotional instability during the detention. After 2 hours of interrogation, he stated that he was able to hear other people's thoughts. Accepted into the project. I was looking at his picture. The face of an ordinary person, but the look. There was anxiety in his eyes, which seemed to seep through the paper. Then there were 021 and 034. The first was the driver, who was detained for suspicious behavior. According to the report, he could predict car breakdowns, and sometimes claimed to know when a passenger was late. The second is a simple peasant from Siberia. He was brought in after the village paramedic stated that the man speaks languages he could not know. These people had one thing in common: they were selected because of hints of something strange. Not proven, not explained. Everything else, their desires, fears, families, didn't matter. They were objects to study, materials that could be used, corrupted and destroyed. I was shown around the complex, showing the cells where the test subjects were kept. The cells were all the same. Concrete walls, a bed, a table and a chair. No personal items, just a sterile void. It was in one of these cells that I saw 014 for the first time. Dmitry was sitting with his hands folded on the table and staring at one point. His gaze was frozen, like a mannequin's, but there was something unnatural about it, as if he saw not the walls around him, but something behind them. "What are they doing to him?" I asked the lab assistant standing next to me. "We're trying different methods," he replied indifferently, as if he were talking about setting up the device. "So far, it reacts poorly." "Is he reacting? For what?" The technician turned to me, raising an eyebrow. "For everything. To the light, to the sounds, to the drugs. It will be played today." I didn't understand what that meant, but I didn't ask any more questions. By evening, the experiment began. As a new employee, I was invited to observe. Dmitry was led into a large room, empty except for a huge speaker installed in the center. They tied him to a metal chair, connected sensors and turned on the recording. At first it was just a normal noise, a white background, barely perceptible. Dmitry sat motionless, only his eyes trembled slightly. Then the noise got louder, turning into a sharp squeak that made even me wince. Dmitry squeezed his eyes shut, but remained silent. The faces of the researchers around me remained impassive. The noise continued to grow. Now it was no longer a squeak, but some kind of low-frequency roar that seemed to be pressing on the chest. Dmitry began to twitch, trying to free himself from the straps. His mouth opened, but I didn't hear a sound. Then his head snapped back and he started screaming. This scream was not human. He was bursting out of the depths, where there should be no place for a voice. It pierced through the mind, forcing me to instinctively clench my fists. I saw one of the lab technicians, who was closest to the speaker, hurriedly go to the door, pale as a sheet. The noise suddenly stopped. Dmitry slumped in his chair, his head fell on his chest. Two paramedics approached and silently unbuckled his seatbelts. He didn't resist, his body was limp like a doll's. "What now?" I asked, not recognizing my own voice. "Let's send him back, we'll give you a day to recover." "Hypnosis tomorrow," one of the researchers replied. I watched Dmitry being carried away, his arms hanging limply. The next day, 014 did not come to his senses. His eyes were open, but empty. He was silent, unresponsive to questions, light or touch. He was kept in a cell and then transferred to an isolation ward. This was the first case, but not the last. I've seen how people are broken, how they are stripped of their human form, how their minds are erased, like a mistake on a piece of paper. Every scream coming from the labs, every scream of pain and terror added to my nightmares. But the scariest part wasn't the sounds. The scariest thing was the look of those who survived. Those eyes, filled with emptiness and hatred, looked at us, the researchers, as if we were not people, but monsters. And maybe they were right. The experiments at Facility 014 were just the beginning. When his body was taken to the isolation ward, The rest of the staff barely paid attention to what had happened. In this place, human life was valued no more than a broken appliance. The next in line was Object 021, the same driver with a special flare. He was brought to the laboratory the next day. The man looked tired, but he was calm, almost confident, as if everything that was happening was just a temporary misunderstanding. His hands were tightly tied behind his back, and sensors were attached to his head, which reached out to monitors flickering in the dark. What will they do with him? I asked the lab technician standing next to me. Standard procedure. Electrical stimulation of the brain, he replied, as if he were talking about the maintenance of equipment. I wanted to ask what it meant, but the words stuck in my throat. The first graphs appeared on the screen in the corner of the room. The electrodes connected to the man's skull began to send pulses. Faint at first, barely perceptible. The subject sat motionless, only occasionally his face twitched from a slight discharge. Raise the voltage, ordered the chief researcher, a tall man in a white lab coat. The current was increased. Now, every pulse caused the chauffeur's muscles to contract, as if he were a puppet controlled by invisible hands. His face was contorted with pain, but he didn't scream. He just clenched his teeth so hard that they gritted. I turned away, unable to look, but the sound of clicks accompanying each new discharge was too loud. Go on, the chief ordered again. Now the current was so strong that the man's body began to convulse as if in convulsions. His mouth opened, and a scream escaped from his throat, not human, but some kind of animal, wild. His eyes widened and his head jerked so sharply that I thought he'd broken his neck. Sine waves. Switch to a new frequency, one of the technicians said. The man continued to scream. His muscles were twitching in unnatural positions, and his arms and legs were twitching like a puppet's. I watched in horror as the graphs flashed on the monitors, the lines jumped sharply up and down, and the researchers looked at it with cold-blooded interest, writing down the results. At some point, the screaming suddenly stopped. The man went limp, his body fell onto the chair as if broken. Dead? What is it? One of the technicians asked. The chief researcher came closer, took off his glasses and looked closely at the subject's face. No, he's alive, disconnected. Add the ammonia. He was brought back to consciousness a few minutes later. The man's eyes were empty, unfocused. His mouth was moving, but there were no words. What do you see? The researcher asked. Lights, the driver croaked. His voice was low, trembling. The light that's coming, from there. Where is from there? The chief continued. The darkness. She's watching, she's calling. His words scared even the lab technicians. One of them softly whispered something under his breath, like a prayer. The man was disconnected from the devices and taken back to the cell. He died the next day, choking on his own vomit. The report said, heart attack. The most terrifying of all was Object 034. He was brought to the laboratory a week after the death of the driver. This man was almost a giant, tall, broad-shouldered, with deep wrinkles on his face that looked as if he had been carved out of stone. Unlike the others, he didn't resist. Even when he was tied to a chair, he stared straight ahead without blinking. He seems calm, one of the technicians remarked. We'll see how long it takes, the chief researcher replied. The experiment began with hypnosis. The researchers tried to put the subject in a trance state. But every time the hypnotist's voice started to sound, the man just looked into his eyes, silently, without a single emotion. After an hour, the lab technicians began to get nervous. It won't budge. Increase the dose. Psychotropic substances were used. The man was injected with a drug that, according to them, was supposed to expand the boundaries of his consciousness. After a few minutes, his pupils dilated and his body began to tremble slightly. Tell me what you see, the hypnotist asked again. The man was silent. His face contorted, as if he was struggling with something inside himself. Finally, he spoke. You don't understand. It's not me who's looking at you. It's you who are watching, through me. His voice was low, almost booming, and the words made my stomach turn cold. A second later, he screamed. His scream was so strong that the speakers on the walls began to crackle. He struggled in the straps, but his gaze remained fixed straight ahead. Stop it! One of the lab technicians shouted. But no one stopped him. The experiment continued until the man collapsed into unconsciousness. This time, even the chief researcher looked worried. I couldn't sleep that night. For the first time, I felt not just anxiety, but real fear. It seemed that something was moving outside the walls of the laboratory, something was awakening. And that something is already looking at us. For the next month, I tried to get used to what was happening inside the complex. But the more I saw, The stronger the feeling became that we were surrounded by something alien, unnatural, which seemed to penetrate even into the very depths of consciousness. The people who were brought here became shells. Their souls, their personalities, dissolved under the pressure of experimentation, being replaced by emptiness. But emptiness wasn't always emptiness. One day I realized that this is not just a destruction, but a replacement. A new series of tests has begun at Facility 047, a young soldier. He was brought to the complex just a week ago. Strong, healthy, with clear eyes and confident bearing, he seemed almost an exemplary example of an ideal test subject. The first experiments were uneventful. Electrical stimulation, sleep deprivation, testing reactions to hypnosis. It was only slightly exhausting, but it didn't break him. His will was strong, almost frightening. But in the third week, we decided to move on to more serious methods. New equipment was installed in the laboratory. A massive device resembling a cross between a dentist's chair and a torture device. The researchers called it a vacuum field, hinting that it creates ideal conditions for the separation of mind and body. They put the soldier in a chair, connected sensors that covered almost his entire body, from his temples to his toes. The room was filled with a hum that resembled the sound of water flowing somewhere in the distance. When the experiment began, 047 felt nothing at first. His eyes remained calm, his breathing even. But after a few minutes, he started blinking more often, as if he saw something in front of him that the others couldn't see. His hands were shaking, and the muscles of his face were tense. "What do you see? What is it?" the chief researcher asked, standing in front of the monitor, on which the biorhythm lines danced like crazy. "The light. No, shadows. They're moving." The soldier's voice was trembling, but it was clear. "They're here." "Who's there?" They want to enter." The soldier was shaking more and more. The technicians recorded the data as if nothing unusual had happened. But I could feel the room getting colder. It seemed that the air around them was getting denser, heavier. "Continue," the chief researcher ordered. The hum increased. Now it seemed that it was coming not only from the device, but also from somewhere underground. The soldier started screaming. His scream was high-pitched as if his soul was being ripped out of his body. But there was something else in that scream, something alien, as if the voice wasn't his own. "They're here! Stop it!" he shouted. "They're looking through me!" His body arched into an arc, his hands tugging hard at the straps that held him in the chair. I could see his eyes rolling back in his head, but after a moment they opened and I almost fell over. His gaze changed. He was no longer the gaze of a man. The pupils dilated so much that they almost covered the iris, and in the depths of these black holes I noticed something, alive. The soldier was disconnected from the device, but it was too late. He no longer answered questions, did not react to sounds and lights. His face was frozen in a strange, crazy half-smile. They took him to the isolation ward, where, as I later learned, he sat motionless, staring at one point on the wall for hours. The next day, something happened to him that no one expected. The guard on duty at the camera heard strange noises coming from inside. He described them as the whispers of many voices. When he entered, he saw that the soldier was standing in the middle of the cell, clutching his face with his hands. His body was shaking, and foam was pouring out of his mouth. "They're inside? They're inside! Stop it!" he shouted. After a minute, he fell silent. The guard left but returned a few hours later with a group of laboratory technicians. When the door was opened, the soldier was no longer in the cell. The lab raised the alarm. They searched every corner of the complex, but they didn't find him. It was impossible to disappear. As they said, no one had left the cells yet. The only recording made that night was from the surveillance camera. It showed a soldier standing against a wall, but then his body begins to tremble, as if under the influence of an invisible force. The light in the cell flickered on and off. When he turned on again, the camera was empty. This case caused panic even among researchers. But what scared me the most was that the incident was described dryly in the report. Object 047 disappeared as a result of an unforeseen anomaly. The experiment is closed. After that, I started feeling weird. When I was alone in my office, it seemed to me that someone was looking at me. Those glances were fleeting, but creepy. One night, I heard whispers coming from the hallway, and when I came out, I saw only shadows. Shadows that moved even though there wasn't a single light source around. Whatever we awakened in these people, it became stronger. And now I was sure that it had already gone beyond the cameras. By the end of the third month, the experiments began to take on an even more grim and inhumane character. If earlier researchers tried to observe at least some boundaries, now any restrictions have disappeared. The main task was to create a perfect object. A person capable of subjugating the minds of others, controlling their fears, thoughts, desires. The idea seemed audacious and impossible, but the team believed that they were close to a breakthrough. All attention was focused on Object 062. He was a young man brought from the countryside, where he worked as a teacher. His dossier stated that he had a phenomenal memory and could easily reproduce text by heart after one reading. His case attracted attention after several of his students began complaining about strange dreams in which he was giving orders. At first, Object 062 seemed like an ordinary person to me. Calm, polite, with a quiet, almost muffled voice. He answered the researchers' questions without unnecessary emotions, expressing neither fear nor anxiety. But there was something about the way he spoke that made me tense. His words seemed to linger in the air, like echoes that continued to resound in his mind even as he fell silent. The first stage of the experiments passed without any special incidents. He was subjected to standard procedures. They tested his reaction to hypnosis, studied the effects of psychotropic drugs, and tested his memory abilities. But at the second stage, the strangeness began. When the subject was connected to a neural stimulation device, his reaction was unexpected. Instead of the usual convulsions and disorientation, he suddenly froze, his eyes closed, and he began to whisper something that could barely be heard. "Amplify the recording," the chief researcher ordered, and the technicians began to increase the sensitivity of the microphones. The subject's voice sounded monotonous, almost mechanical. "They're waiting. They know, they see." "Who sees it?" the researcher asked. The subject did not respond, but his voice continued to sound. He seemed to be speaking several languages at once. I caught familiar words in Latin, German, even Old Slavic. His face remained calm, as if he was just reading a book. "Boost the power," the researcher shouted. The device howled louder, and the object's body began to tremble. His voice became stronger, richer. Now he was no longer whispering, but almost shouting. "They're already here. They've always been here. You brought them. You opened the door." The lights in the lab flickered. The monitors started showing chaotic lines that no one could explain. The technicians rushed around trying to regain control of the equipment, but nothing worked. The object suddenly went silent. His eyes opened and he stared at the main researcher. It wasn't just a look, it was rage mixed with something inhuman. "You're the first he said with frightening calm. The next moment, the head researcher screamed, clutching his head. His body was shaking, his eyes were rolling back in his head, and blood was coming out of his mouth. He fell to the floor, and everyone rushed to him, but it was too late. A minute later, he was dead. There was a panic in the room. One of the lab technicians turned off the device's power, but the subject continued to sit without moving. He just looked at us, as if watching for a reaction. "Take him to the isolation ward." "Stop it," someone shouted. 2 guards came to pick him up, but as soon as they touched his shoulder, both collapsed to the floor without a sound. Their bodies remained motionless, and their faces were frozen in grimaces of horror. I was paralyzed by fear. It was no longer an experiment. Something got out of control, and I realized that it no longer obeys us. After a few minutes, the object stood up. No one stopped him. He left the lab, and we stood there in a daze, unable to move. The project was closed the next day. Officially, it was due to loss of funding and insufficient efficiency. In practice, because no one knew what to do next. Object 062 has disappeared. He was not found either in the cells or outside the complex. All information about him and what happened in the laboratory was destroyed. The researchers who survived the day were transferred to other units or sent on vacation. But it seemed to me that this was not the end. Part of me knew that the object hadn't disappeared. He just went to a place where we won't find him anymore. Or worse, to where he'll find us. It's been many years. The events that took place in that underground complex have long become only memories, gloomy, like smoke from a fire that will not dissipate in any way. Every time I tried to forget, it seemed like the past itself refused to let go. Sometimes they were dreams, long, painful ones, where the sounds echoed loudly in empty corridors, and the shadows moved as if alive. Sometimes the memories came flooding back suddenly, in the middle of an ordinary day, making my heart beat faster, like the night Object 062 disappeared. After the project was closed, I was transferred to another department. Technically, for conscientious service, but I knew it was just a way to get rid of witnesses. We were ordered to be silent. Not to talk about what we saw, not to discuss what happened even with each other. All the documents were destroyed, the archives were sealed, and those who tried to ask questions were quickly silenced. But one day I finally got the answer to the main question that had been bothering me all this time. What was that? I got a call late in the evening. The voice on the other end of the line was muffled, low, almost a whisper. Comrade, we have something that might interest you. Come back the next day. Important. The address was familiar. An old archive, long abandoned and abandoned. The place where we once kept reports on the Sphinx Project. I didn't want to go, but something inside me was pushing me forward. The archive looked as if it had been abandoned a long time ago. Dusty shelves covered with cobwebs, old documents piled in piles. In the center of the room stood a man in a gray coat, whose face was hidden by a hood. He handed me a small folder. That's all that's left here, Mbaba. He said, without looking up. I opened the folder. Inside were notes made by the hand of one of the researchers, and photographs, black and white, grainy but still clear. One of them had Object 062 on it. He was standing in the center of the lab, his eyes wide and his mouth twisted into a strange half-smile. But the main thing that shocked me was the shadows around him. They did not fall, as usual, from the light of the lamps. They wrapped around his body, moving as if alive, stretching out in different directions, as if trying to escape beyond the boundaries of photography. I turned the page. There was a report on the latest experiment on it. It was written immediately after the object disappeared. There were no scientific formulations in the text, only panic lines. We didn't discover what we were looking for. It's not a person. This is not consciousness. It's something else, old, ancient, living beyond our comprehension. We have freed it, and it no longer belongs to us. Followed by scattered words written in a trembling hand. The gate. Another world. They're coming. The last page was blank, except for one phrase written in red ink. It's inside us. I slammed the folder shut and felt a chill run down my spine. The hooded man silently turned around and left. I wanted to catch up with him and ask him where he got these notes, but my legs wouldn't obey me. Something in me stopped me, as if warning me that knowing more would mean losing the remnants of my mind. I returned home that night, but I still couldn't sleep. It seemed to me that someone was standing outside the window. When I finally gathered my courage and looked, I saw nothing. But I still felt that look. I've been avoiding mirrors ever since. Not because I'm afraid to see myself, but because I'm afraid to see something else behind me. Something that is still here, that will never leave us, because one day we opened the door to it.